Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
Bowser gave the nice people, the BLM riots, it wasn't a mosaic. Was it K Street? Does it still say BLM? I should know this. I mean, I live outside of Washington, but they painted in big letters. And so I thought surely Trump would also get his name painted in the streets, as a kind of, inverse commemoration. But next time.
Alas, no. No, I think the main lesson is that when the real ruling class gets freaked out about something and some unrest goes against them, then they really crack down. Welcome, everyone, once again to the Roundtable, the American Minds publishers and editors podcast here at the Claremont Institute. I'm Ryan Williams, your host, president of the Claremont Institute, publisher of the Claremont Review of Books. We've got a skeleton crew today. I've got Spencer Clavin, associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind, and James Pullis, executive editor of the American Mind. Barr and Peterson are out in the wild doing Lord knows what. Well, gentlemen, I thought we'd bring up an old topic today, but in old wine and new skins, I forget how the saying goes. But
I think don't do it is the don't stop now is the scriptural advisement on that.
I just wanted to talk a bit about David French, who's been more vocal than normal, which is saying something, in light of the week of commentary on the quote-unquote insurrection in the Capitol, et cetera. I don't want to downplay it too much, of course. There's the newest video I saw was pretty despicable, which was them at the sort of the front of Congress dragging a Capitol Hill police officer halfway down a handicap ramp and beating him with a MAGA flag. So I don't mean to minimize that. We stand against violence to achieve political ends here at the Claremont Institute. So that being said, French actually has taken up all that plenty. We don't need to dwell on it, but he had a series of tweets about Twitter, well, first about Facebook and then about Twitter banning Trump. I'll just read the three of them that we wanted to take up and then put it in context with his first actual piece he wrote, which was about getting Trump off Twitter after he'd been banned from Facebook. Tweet one, these were all, they're like January 8th and 9th. The most powerful man in the world incited an attack on our republic. The free American citizens who work for Twitter responded with an action freely chosen, and MAGA voices wail about lost followers as evidence of totalitarianism. Snowflakes. Tweet 2. Part of the story of the private sector response to the insurrection is the reality that the political branches failed to contain Trump and law enforcement failed to contain the assault. American citizens are using the power they have to protect this country against an attack. Third tweet, final one. The wisdom of Twitter's decision to ban Trump is debatable. I think it's a hard call, but appropriate. However, describing the decision of free American citizens to defy the government and ban POTUS as somehow totalitarian is just bizarre. It's an actual exercise of liberty. So his principles on this front, he's announced in this piece which preceded all those tweets. And he wants to emphasize his two main principles, which I wanted to dissect a little bit. First, it is not the government's role to tell private corporations how to run their platforms. Second, private corporations should use their freedom to moderate speech as much as possible in a viewpoint-neutral fashion. Yes, prohibit porn, harassment, and bullying to create family-friendly spaces if you so desire, but don't put your thumb on the partisan scales. So, I mean, part of the complaining about French on all this is, well, like a lot of the libertarians' takes on the social media platforms, first, it's not the government's role to tell private corporations how to run their platforms. It elides the whole question of Section 230, which it was the government's role in exempting these companies from a certain range of legal action against them that allowed them to consolidate this oligopolistic power in the first place and sort of, as James has put it, create a kind of walled garden public square that they control and can manipulate. And then they manifestly do precisely the thing that French says they should not do, which is don't put your thumb on the partisan scales. So in light of all that, you get the sense with a lot of this with French that he's defending principles that exist only in his own head as a practical matter in how these companies run themselves. And he just does not take up at all the question in which, say, the jurisprudential jurisprudential tradition of maybe the late 19th century would say that these large social media platforms, because of their network effects and their quasi-monopolistic and oligopolistic control, and even in light of the recent Parler nuking, we can get into that later, clearly are coordinating on some of these things, the extent to which these are all businesses affected with the public interest. Now, that's debatable, but I think to not even really bring it up and just to say they're private citizens protecting their country, taking free action, seems to just completely blow past the more important questions about social media's control over our public discourse.
Well, it seems to me that what we're seeing in French, and this has been his role for a while, he's kind of been the avatar of this, the extreme reductio ad absurdum of something that goes much beyond French. People pick on him. Sort of Mari chose him as the person to identify as the representative of this form of so-called conservatism, but it's much bigger than him. It combines, sort of defines what it means to be a conservative as complete faith in the market structure, defined as, a complete refusal to interfere in any of the ways in which people interact and do business at a governmental level, based on some sort of assumption that the government is the only entity in American life that could ever possibly accrue to itself enough power to meaningfully nullify our fundamental rights, which, again, we are always in the business of reminding people here at Claremont, don't actually depend on whether somebody has enough power to tell us we can't exercise them, because the person that gives them to us is God, and God actually gets to trump all of these crazy tech moguls. And the situation here is precisely the one that form of conservatism is totally unequipped to recognize, which is that a private company, a privately owned entity, which, leaving aside the fact that it obviously is in cahoots with government in all sorts of ways, but even just leaving that aside, Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos and a number of other people have accrued unto themselves a degree of power which allows them to seriously violate the First Amendment. And I'm sorry, but that's actually just not something that you can be allowed to do. And if it's technically legal in a number of ways, then that means our laws are inadequate to meet the moment. So, yeah, this has been a problem in a kind of dead faux Reaganism for a long time. It's based on a sort of bumper stickerized version of an ideology, a sort of neoliberal ideology that was itself never meant to be a life philosophy so much as a coalitional alliance between people trying to bring down the Soviet Union. And it's now failing in the most spectacular sort of way, as indeed are many of the sort of ideological faiths of that era.
So my thoughts on this have gone in the following direction. One reason why we are faced with this sort of battle of dueling characterizations of what happened at the Capitol event is because it is, by any stretch, just a very bizarre sequence of events.
Yeah.
But another reason is because the event that played out is one which you do not need to be a conspiracy theorist remotely in order to understand. This is the classic kind of political event where intelligence communities will have individuals present, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's the Arab Spring, you name it. If you are the head of a major intelligence agency and there is a major, massive, largely peaceful public demonstration going on in a capital city at a time of political instability, If you do not get bodies on the ground at that event, you are in dereliction of duty and you should be fired, and you probably will be fired. That whole topic of conversation is not something that the news is representing to us. And it is one which, even seasoned scholars of intelligence and political unrest are not pushing into the discussion. And largely, anyone who wants to sort of freelance this on their own and just ask questions is going to be portrayed as a crackpot. When in fact, the history of political unrest and the history of intelligence agencies makes it clear that this is the kind of event where major intelligence agencies are going to be interested and in some way are going to be involved. And of course, this is all playing out at a time when there is a global struggle among major intelligence agencies to help shape the battle space in this unfolding digital era. It's a hot and heavy competition, and we have an intelligence community. So does Israel. So does Russia. So does China. So do the Brits. So do it's a full house, and all of these guys, are doing their jobs in many cases to the best of their ability. The intelligence community here, and of course abroad, has longstanding relationships with media, with entertainment, with strategic digital companies. This is common knowledge. The CIA runs their stuff on Amazon servers. Amazon servers have a good product. It's not, there's no sort of like evil plot here. This is just the way that these institutions interface with each other. It's not a surprise. It's largely common knowledge. And it's not at all part of this discussion at all. We cannot discuss what is happening to the regime in America with regard to the interrelationship among global intelligence agencies, the entertainment industry, the legacy media, and the major strategic tech companies in the US. And so, of course, if we're not going to be discussing these things, and largely because we're all placed behind this, 7 veils of ignorance, something which the news will not, a predicament the news will not get us out of, we're going to have to fall back on having dueling characterizations. And whoever has sort of the biggest megaphone, or whoever can, roust the biggest mob, or whoever can, to take over the TV channels the most, is going to have the advantage. That's fundamentally unstable, and it is not how, to be frank, political questions of this magnitude are decided under a Republican form of government.
Yeah, to add some irony, James, you know this, of course, but just for our listeners' sake, speaking of foreign intelligence, one of the lovely impeachment managers in the House from the vote today was Eric Swalwell, who was just honeypotted, we found out, by Chinese intelligence, which is just wonderful.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the dimensions of this phenomenon that you're identifying, James, the sort of sense of complete helplessness that is evinced by being just at a loss for information, right? I mean, we feel it, and it's our jobs to know something or other about this sort of stuff. Imagine how the people that are not, regularly scrolling Twitter, that are not, reading white papers, that are not obsessing over this stuff. Imagine how they feel. And I would go further and say that, as Ryan said at the beginning, we abhor unruly mobs bursting into political violence. That's something we totally denounce. But if you want to prevent something from happening, a good place to start is try to understand what causes it to happen. And to me, one of the things that is most readily apparent about the crowd on January 6th is that that's a group of people who feel desperate and who feel as if they have no political outlet, except that no politician will listen to them except Donald Trump. And they have no means of participating in the political process of the American government except through these extreme measures. Now, I believe that all of those beliefs are false, but I understand that that's how they feel. And talking about them as if they were a serious attempt at an insurrection and addressing them as if, this is really the threat to the American regime, is a really good way to make them feel as if this actually is the only option that they have. And shutting them out from all real relevant information to the major questions of our time is another really good way to make them feel as if they do not have any mode of redress, any way of seeking some solution to the many problems that plague the average American, other than these terrible radical forms of action. Again, it's because we find them so terrible, because we find them so appalling, that it's terrifying to think that basically the response from the people in charge of information and the people in charge of government has been, yes, in fact, you are a radical sect. You are marginalized. You're on the outs from society. And the only time that you've ever actually done anything meaningful in American public life is when you did this thing for which we are now going to hound you out of every major available source of joy and security in your own person.
Yeah. Plus the French piece added about the president. At present, he is a danger to our republic, and private corporations should not help him spread his seditious message. That was on Thursday. I think David wrote this on Thursday after the Wednesday melee at the Capitol. The evening of which featured Trump telling everyone to go home and be peaceful, and then another call the next day for them to quit doing the things that the MAGA movement is not known for, as he puts it. Another video today to that effect, and a statement as well about the inauguration. So, I mean, I don't know. I guess French is sort of overtaken by events, among other things. To say nothing of the fact that, especially on Twitter, I mean, there are all manner of murderous mullahs and terrorists on Twitter, fomenting all kinds of nastiness. So the real problem is just, not the real problem, but a real problem is this patently obvious double standard that seems to rule at these places, where they really are, and no doubt with either the at least the participation of foreign intelligence, at least, if not the some sort of tacit arrangement with various groups of Five Eyes intelligence across the Anglosphere, at least. This is just another way in which social media is very, very, very far from what French claims it even ought to be, or even sometimes suggests it kind of is. It's in many ways a giant information op, and the only way to break through it is to allow more, not less, speech on it. I don't quite know what the political remedy is for it, Spencer, on our Substack. Tell me what you really think today, which will probably come out in a week or two. We talked a little bit about the immediate prospects for Section 230 reform, and I say they're pretty dim for opening up the public discourse on social media. But I don't know, the just relentless tone deafness with which French and others speak about social media, it's just remarkable. I did want to flag this one thing, James. This is right up your alley. James Lindsay reported this, and Jake put it in our show notes for today. The fact that on Wednesday, that is last Wednesday, the day of infamy, Executive Vice President of Content for Cumulus Media, which owns our iHeart Radio and iHeart Media, and owns a bunch of the AM and FM stations across the country. His internal memo said, "We need to help induce national calm now," and then proceeded to forbid any employees to suggest that the election was still ongoing, or that the way he put it is, the election has been resolved and there are no alternate acceptable paths, and paths in quotes. Anyway, I thought that was interesting. James Lindsay's point is that there's a big section of our intellectual and political class, and I include David French among them, that still doesn't understand the extent to which our media organizations are in the business of opinion manipulation rather than the platform business, or as James might put it, fantasy creation and manipulation. It just seems that David French's of the world don't have not even the faintest clue about what the modern media environment is about and how it interacts with politics.
This is the case, and it is, I mean, at least for me, like, I'm not trying to hurt anyone's feelings, but I just like, this is disqualifying. I mean, how can you participate in our global public discourse if you do not even understand the nature of said discourse? It is, of course, inducing calm just brings to mind, like, we are going to feed 2 Xanny bars to each of our employees and, start playing Teletubbies on blast so that Americans can go to their quiet place. But this is further evidence of just how weak the regime feels and considers itself to be, which is, for any patriot of any ideological persuasion, this is troubling. This is not what you want to see when you have like the Joint Chiefs of Staff making these statements and companies just sort of flailing because they have unionized employees yelling at them and taking these harsh and precipitous actions, and then hoping that when the dust settles, we'll find our way back to normal one day, and that day gets farther and farther away. When I see these statements coming out of the Joint Chiefs and elsewhere, again, to me, this is signaling foreign audiences. And I know that, over the past 4 years, much of the emphasis on bad foreign actors has come, of course, from the left, courtesy of Russiagate. But, I think that it's entirely fair for any intelligent observer to note that other powers around the world have done quite well, relatively speaking, under these, in the post-internet era, and that America has kind of fallen on its face over and over again. And that's not necessarily as a result of stronger foreign competition, although that's part of it. It's a result of a leadership class and an established elite that has turned out to simply not be up to the job. They haven't succeeded for ordinary Americans. They haven't even really succeeded for themselves. Some of them have managed to get rich and sort of climb into their magic hot air balloon and float over the horizon and hope that things will improve one day. But even by their own standards, they're struggling. They can't really make sense of what world we're in. Some crazy looking demonstrators come into the Capitol like through the velvet ropes, and you've got the members of Congress in a state of complete panic, just terror, I think, expecting that their throats are going to be slit. These are people who are badly spooked, and they are way out of their depth. They don't know what is happening to our country and to the world. And yet, these are people who are making decisions. These are people who are opining with moral certainty about what's going on. And the ball is about to be handed to them. It's going to be their problem starting in a few days. And based on the polling that I've seen and based on the mood of people across the political spectrum who I've spoken to in private conversation, it's just not going to be enough to say, okay, well, job number one right now is to destroy Al-Qaeda domestic terrorism in the United States and embark on a domestic war on terror against, it's so that we can have demogrification. That isn't going to solve people's problems. People can't pay their mortgages. People's families are being split apart because they're doxing each other for going to rival rallies. People's small businesses have been destroyed, and you have Biden coming out and saying like, well, if you're a person of color and you have a small business, like, you'll get relief. That's not going to work for people. And these deep-seated problems that have been sown for decade upon decade by this leadership class, they're not going to have Donald Trump to kick around anymore. And even if they go on a domestic war on terror against their supposed internal enemies, it's not going to address real people's problems. They're going to have to figure out the market for themselves and prop up the economy somehow. Silicon Valley is starting to realize that they live in a different world. And so, I find it sort of boring and beside the point when these, folks come out and they make these bold pronouncements and they kowtow to their employees and do what they think will get them through the week. And yet they can't be trusted. They've lost their authority, and that's why they see themselves as so weak. And so it's going to be choppy water, starting in a couple of weeks and for at least 4 years.
Yeah. one thing to keep an eye on too, and I think a lot of Americans will be as well, given what we witnessed over the summer, will be precisely what kind of crimes and what punishments are being meted out by this, new task force on sedition out of DOJ. I hope I'm wrong, but I suspect a lot of people who thought they could be in that building who otherwise really didn't touch a Capitol Hill police or break anything are nonetheless, some of them, probably not all of them, going to get the book thrown at them and actually might do some real time when really what they should be focusing on was the seditionists who were beating the Capitol Hill police with a flat MAGA flag, or anyone who's breaking windows or stealing things. But I fear it will not be confined to those. And then on top of all that, we're not the first people to mention this, but after a summer in which it seemed that you really could riot and burn with impunity unless you were actually caught on video shooting someone in the head. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it's pretty rich to see this task force and people like Lindsey Graham, talking in a full high dudgeon about bringing people to justice for sedition. Now, we should acknowledge, the argument out there is not without merit that, the caricature version of it from some wag on Twitter was, I'm sorry, it's not a real riot not a real riot until you burn down a Wendy's. It is a little different to charge the Capitol while they're counting the electoral vote. At least because the federal laws surrounding violation of the Capitol building are a little harsher, I think, than rampaging around your neighborhood in Kenosha or wherever else. But this bears close watching, and it will be a measure of the overreaction and overcorrection, which I fully expect from the new Congress and the new Justice Department. That I worry will do nothing, as James, you say, will really do nothing to induce calm now, or lay the grounds for some sort of civic reconciliation that will allow us to stop our lurching from crisis to regime crisis. Like the Bourbons, I think our ruling class remember nothing and learn nothing. And we're in for a rough one because of that, but it's our job to keep an eye on it and keep reminding folks of what's important and what is actually happening.
Yeah, at the least, if, of course, we can acknowledge it's a different thing to rush into the Capitol, to perform acts of violence in the Capitol, than it is to riot in American City. And I say that I actually don't think you can compare apples to oranges and say, well, one of these is worse and one is better. They have different forms of gravity, and they appall us in different ways. There's real symbolic weight to storming the Capitol. But of course, there's symbolic weight also to defacing and toppling monuments of our founding fathers. So there was that dimension to the summer 2020 riots as well. And more to the point, if you want to make a distinction between the kinds of riots that we're talking about, fine. But in order to have any moral standing at all, there's got to be at least some acknowledgement that burning down American cities, shooting cops in cold blood, spray painting all cops are bastards onto public monuments, right? These things are at least kind of bad, right? You have to at least go that far in the direction of hashtag both sides. And what we have instead from the left is celebration and, in many cases, encouragement. And in the case of, for example, Kamala Harris, a public fundraising campaign to bail out the participants in these these leftist forms of public unrest. So I don't think it's unfair to accuse politicians who are willing to go to that extent of hypocrisy, to accuse them of a double standard, even if we want to say that, yes, there's something different about what happened on January 6th compared to what happened in summer of 2020. But this double standard, I think, is in some ways of a piece with the double standards that you indicated on social media and in big tech, Ryan. The classic sort of the clincher of that double standard was when Parler was kicked off of Amazon's servers because there were people on it who were saying things and planning gatherings that, in the eyes of Amazon, represented a danger of more, as they would put it, insurrection, more riots, more violence. And whereas it's certainly true that social media has become one of the major gathering points and points of planning for people to come together politically and do all sorts of things, good and bad. It's also the case, of course, that Twitter, of all places, was one of the central places where the people who gathered on January 6th did their gathering. So I await the moment when there will be calls for Twitter to be zapped off of my phone and off of my internet browsers. But I'm not holding my breath because, of course, right, nobody would ever suggest that in that case it's the app that's the problem, it's the host that's the problem. And so that is really, again, the kind of reductio ad absurdum of the publisher platform distinction. If you are conservative, if you're standing for certain ideals of liberty of discourse, well, then you are to be held responsible for the most extreme things that are said and done on your platform. But if you demonstrate your willingness to toe the line and to collaborate with Democrats in extending the vilification from the real crazies out as far as it will go into the conservative, well, then it's not your fault to say nasty or scary things on your platform. The Ayatollah Khomeini can come out onto Twitter and tweet all sorts of disgusting things that are, in fact, if anything, is reminiscent of the ugliest atrocities of the 20th century. It's the sort of stuff that gets said in that corner of Twitter. But nobody would hold Twitter responsible for that because, well, they have a policy of taking these people and holding them to account in their own way and at their own discretion. So, both of these forms of hypocrisy amount essentially to a ruling class that has one message, and that is, we rule, you are ruled, we win, you lose. And that's not a message that is sustainable for all the reasons that James indicates, because people will continue to suffer. We win, you lose is not a plan for making people's lives better. And when people continue to suffer and they are told over and over again that they are the subject and the people who are dining out and enriching themselves upon the failures and the disasters that they themselves have caused, when that happens, you have a recipe for really ugly stuff, whether you advocate that ugly stuff or, as we do not, you do not.
Yeah, this is a technological problem with social media. I mean, the institutionalization of a single standard, best practices, as the corporatists will put it, for content moderation is incompatible with the habits and mores of a free people. That's a hard circle to square. Jack of Twitter CEO fame tries to do it in a string of tweets that he's finally put out, sort of hemming and hawing over the uncomfortable realities of banning the president of the United States from Twitter and the circumstances that surround it. He's trying to be thoughtful. But I think the content moderation problem and the standardization or unification of content moderation within a single regime arises from seeing social media the way that he at least says he does, which is part of a global public conversation. He says, yeah, this was not so great. That's not the quote. The quote is, it sets a precedent I feel is dangerous. The power an individual or corporation has over a part of the global public conversation. He wants to sort of figure out how to do it better or whatever. And he goes on to say, yes, we all need to look critically at inconsistencies of our policy and enforcement. Yes, we need to look at how our service might incentivize distraction and harm. Yes, we need more transparency in our moderation operations. All this can't erode a free and open global internet. There isn't a free and open global internet. There isn't a global public conversation. Already, these things do not exist. There is, to a degree, a somewhat open Western internet. There are a couple other internets out there that people generally have an okay time. But Russia, China, the EU runs their internet differently from the way the US does. Major differences. Uganda shut down social media for its election, and Twitter comes out and says, "Oh, this is terrible. This is a disaster for the open internet. We can't have people shutting down their internet because of a presidential election." It's impossible to have consistency because the whole concept of a public global conversation is a fantasy. You get to pick two. It can be public and it can be conversation, but not global. It can be global and it can be public, but not a conversation. Or, you do the math. I'm not good enough at math to do that. If I was typing it out, I'd be much better off. Yeah. But so long as the heads of social media continue to see their mission as running the global public conversation, we are going to hit up against these problems again and again and again. Because if it's one public conversation for the entire world, there's got to be one standard at a certain point. Certain things have to be in, certain things have to be out, and you got to comb through it on a case-by-case basis. And the immense imposition of regulatory authority and the invasiveness of that kind of regulatory practice is simply out of step with what Americans as a people are comfortable with and are used to and depend on for their civic participation. That there's no like easy answer to how to extricate ourselves from this problem. And part of the reason why is because so many Americans are just degenerate and depraved. I mean, they're all over the internet. The internet allows them to find each other. They spend all their time saying and talking about sort of horrible things that no one should have to look at or think about. And in a society that is on that level, that is being forcibly moved into a new era with a minimum of input, you're going to get civil unrest. You're going to get political unrest, and it's going to happen on the right and on the left, as it has in the past. And this is a subject that Jack and others are just very reluctant to break open. And, although that's for obvious reasons, it's not my problem, it's theirs. And ultimately, the way to take responsibility for it is by stepping away from the idea that the global public conversation is real or that it should exist.
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we should move on to impeachment and wither DJT. But I wanted to say quickly, that's not to preclude you from adding your thoughts right after this, Spencer, or Barr, who's joined us. Jump in if you want. But we should cover part of how this narrative is going, just so people who don't get paid to watch all this stuff constantly are sort of fluent in it. Don Lemon's point the other night on his little buddy time with Chris Cuomo, when Cuomo's show ends and Lemon's show starts, Lemon was saying, stop all this whataboutism about the Summers riots. The difference between the Capitol storming and the Summers riots is that the Summers riots were based on a truth and the Capitol storming was based on a lie. But whereas we argued months ago in the pages of the American Mind, the biggest and most pathos-inducing premise of the Summers riots was in fact a lie, which is that Black people were somehow on the hunted list by police and others, that every sort of disparate impact in social and cultural matters, in employment or anything else, was the result of a sick society with systemic racism down to the core. I mean, we've done our part to try to debunk this claim, and that's work that's going to be ongoing. But as far as we're concerned, it's a deep disagreement with Don Lemon about the character of all this. Even if we conceded or the premise that the Capitol storming was based on a lie, which we don't for a second, I think we've all of the opinion that there was quite a bit of fraud in this election. Was it enough to tip the whole thing? We may never know, but we have friends who are working on it and trying to get to the bottom of it. But anyway, even if we conceded that premise that the Capitol Hill was based on a lie, we would not concede Lemon's premise that somehow truth was at the heart of the grievances of the summer. So what you fall back upon is two different sets of partisans and activists and protesters, both of whom passionately feel that they're being stomped on unheeded, that a great injustice is being done, and the just complete lack of empathy for that feeling on the right, for the feeling of those people who went to the Capitol and to D.C., the 500,000 of them, is just, I mean, it's it does a disservice to the intelligence, both emotional and intellectual, of many of our elites, even on the left. Many of them are neither emotionally nor intellectually intelligent, but they're better than this. Our elites are better than this. Unfortunately, as James implied much earlier in the show, they just continue to fail to understand their countrymen, and we're feeling the effects of that, unfortunately, and will for some time.
Yeah, that is an example of somebody. The Don Lemon quote that you cite is an example of somebody that should not be taken seriously from a moral standpoint, right? Well, because I mean, if your assessment of this situation is literally just boils down to it's okay to oppress these people because they are bad, and these riots are good because they are good, then really you have no place in the public conversation. And it's not just Lemon, right? I mean, Sam Harris, the supposedly great free-thinking intellectual of the intellectual dark web, the great mind of our generation, tweeted, I think today or recently, something to the effect of, I oppose cancel culture strongly, but it's okay to cancel psychopaths. You can oppose cancellation and still cancel psychopaths, which again boils right on down to, here are these things that we are doing, which for my whole lifetime were singled out and identified in high school and thereafter as the things that authoritarians do: shutting down free speech, clamping down on freedoms in the wake of and the lead up to an election, right? All of these things are textbook examples that my liberal professors and high school teachers, solemnly and bravely warned me of. And now, in the blindness of the human mind, here is Sam Harris, a supposedly big brain guy, out here saying, "Oh, it's okay if we do it to the bad people," right? As if every nasty regime in the history of humanity hasn't had exactly that justification for its worst offenses against God and man, right? That is exactly the point of even warning against these things, is to keep yourself from saying, "Oh, but these people are the bad ones." So that much at least seems grounds for dismissal on the part of any sensible person. If you want to have a conversation about public unrest and how it's spreading like wildfire on the right, to the right from the left, or even just throughout the American electorate, absolutely fine. But if the premise of that conversation is, well, there are good guys and bad guys here, so treat them different, then you're a child. The only thing that I wanted to add to what James was saying is that in addition to that Uganda thing, where they shut down the internet, right, there were other notable sort of international reactions to this, foremost among them that of Angela Merkel, who were sort of lauded by conservatives for having said, this is problematic. It's problematic that they kicked the president of the United States off of Twitter. But others have noted, quite rightly, that the implication of her comments was it's problematic because really the government should be doing this. The government should have a stronger role in managing and watching the public conversation when it pertains to matters of the common good and public health. And it all speaks to James's point that the whole reality of a nation state is that you make these decisions before you embark upon whatever brave new technology comes into being for communicating information, and on the basis of your national principles, you decide how to run this sort of thing. America already had a come to Jesus about this during the presidency of John Adams, and the fallout from the Alien and Sedition Act began what was then a conversation that has endured for the lifetime of the country about the implications of our having enshrined free speech in the Bill of Rights, and of putting it in the fundamental law of the land. And that's, a radical thing, a new thing. And that's what should be dictating our reaction to this, not some vague notion that we can abide by the standards of everywhere. We're not everywhere. We're America.
Yeah, quite right. Any thoughts on any of this, David? Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah, no, I'll talk in the next segment. For listeners, I missed our kickoff time by half an hour, and my kids, there was COVID outbreak at their school.
Oh,
so
no.
They've just been home, and it's like messed up my circadian rhythm all over again. So I was actually coming out of a daze.
Perfectly understandable. For those that don't know, David has 2 children under 5. So, is that right, David?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully they remain under 5 more years.
Yeah, that can be exhausting, I'm sure.
But one thing I did want to add is that I was curious your guys' thoughts on some of the insane pictures on the number of National Guard members that have been deployed to Washington. Now, no one disagrees that we have to keep the Capitol safe, but it's like these weird scenes out of a besieged city where you just have thousands of troops, asleep in the Capitol. There's like a picture somebody took, some Getty photographer took today. I don't know if you guys caught it. They're all in their fatigues, sleeping, and then people tweet in and say, "Oh, the horror," and this is now America. But when you abstract from the events on the 6th, you have people streaming into the Capitol, but how many of them were there? 100, 200? This is the thing that kind of it seems disproportionate. 20,000 troops now in DC for 200 people that went in, 30 of whom maybe were ultra violent, or I'm understating what happened.
Maybe. I mean, I think it seems to me, I don't know. We'll see. I guess you could maybe up to 1,000 went in, probably more like 500. I mean,
really?
That DOJ task force has already charged 150, I think, or charged 70, and they have another 70 or 80 to go. And he warned that number could rise even exponentially. So I would say at least a few hundred. Yeah. So you're probably close to right. But no, I agree. 20,000 troops. We underestimate to the extent to which the presence is an overreaction, probably for a pretty, as we've mentioned, a lot of these Congress people were pretty spooked. And as Ben Domenech has pointed out, I think publicly on the Federalist Radio Hour last week, the average congressperson has really no security walking around all the time. They have maybe a body man, but leadership has a little more security. So I think this is both the result of our hysterical media environment and the desire from the new leadership to encourage as much bad optics as possible. Pelosi greeting 3 lines of 20 people across at the Capitol steps in the morning. It makes for great photography, but checkpoints all around the Capitol and 20,000 troops, seems like a bit of an overreaction. So
and then you've got Muriel Bowser up in the mix, closing down roads, driving people insane. The comms that I'm hearing out of DC are that it's just an impossible situation. No one can get around anywhere. Yeah. I mean, we got, what we learned from the summer riots and what we've learned since then is that, amid the weakened regime, I mean, let's face it, when the riots were going down, this was not a sign of strength among folks who said, oh my God, if we don't capitulate to this movement, then we're going to be eaten first. Yeah. There is a panic. And, in a country like ours, where it covers a lot of territory, a lot of human beings, a lot of cities, a lot of different jurisdictions, healthy federalism, the possibility for political variance up and down the chain of federalism is real. And it's getting to a point where, I mean, you saw this with the mayor of Portland, mayors of other cities, they just wouldn't enforce the law. Yeah. And so what you're seeing is you get layer after layer after layer of local and state and the federal bureaucracy, and then like super federal bureaucracy, and then the military. And it's almost as if all these different layers of bureaucracy are too big to fit through the same aperture in any kind of crisis situation, or even a situation where you're trying to stop a crisis before it starts. If there's any sort of testimony to anything that testifies to some of the inherent problems of limitless bureaucracy, it's this, that you end up with this patchwork of plural bureaucracies that can't agree and are stepping over each other's feet, creating confusion, just infuriating ordinary people. And meanwhile, they continue to receive their steady paychecks and continue to make mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah. And Bowser gave the nice people, the BLM riots, it wasn't a mosaic, Was it K Street? Does it still say BLM? I should know this. I mean, I live outside of Washington, but they painted in big letters, and so I thought surely Trump would also get his name painted in the streets, as a kind of inverse commemoration. But next time,
alas, no. I think the main lesson is that when the real ruling class gets freaked out about something and some unrest goes against them, then they really crack down. I mean, what other lesson can we draw from the last 6 months than that? I mean, we can draw many others, of course, but it's a pretty striking one. Well, we have a little bit of time left. We talk quickly about impeachment. I mean, according to ABC, Jake told us just a few minutes ago, the impeachment vote was 232 to 197. You've got a handful of GOP members who voted yes, fewer than 20, and then some who abstained, including Dan Crenshaw, sorry. Impeachment, somebody tweeted, I forget who, when your impeachment managers include Ted Lieu and Eric Swalwell, it's not a serious effort. I mean, it's serious in the sense that they held the vote, but Mitch McConnell has signaled that he's not going to team up with Chuck Schumer to convene the Senate in time to try this thing before inauguration. He has indicated that he's willing to try it at some point after inauguration, which I'm pretty sure will be unprecedented in American history, an impeachment after someone left office. The constitutional scholars are all over the map on the propriety of this, but the goal would be, of course, to bar Trump from holding office subsequently. We can talk about impeachment if you guys like. We just have 5 minutes left, but I will also raise maybe the more interesting question, which is whether Donald Trump after January 20th.
Yes. Well, I mean, like, why hasn't he been no statements or anything like this? After
no, where
20th.
After? No, he had another statement out today basically telling, he had a statement out today telling everyone, both written and then video, telling everyone, you must, especially if you're in the Capitol for inauguration, you must be peaceful. Do not break the law. Do not vandalize. This is not what I stand for. It's not what America stands for. So
I tell you, if he's being advised well by political consultants, this is a tremendous incision point he has. The fractious nature of the GOP, like, leadership like Liz Cheney calling for his ouster, the whole party's whacked out, and there's a real vacuum, and he could do something with that outside of obviously since he's no longer in power. But if he can harness some of that energy, it's still there. Somebody has to capture it.
Yeah, the question, I guess, is how ambitious is he? Does he want to try to start building a alternative media empire, which I think he definitely could? He has a large built-in audience, as they say. Or does he want to build a new political party, a new third party, continue to play around in Republican Party politics, starting in Florida or wherever? It will be very interesting. Or does he just want to wash his hands of the mainstream establishment political fight and do something more interesting outside of the normal political ecosystem, both state and national? And then the question, of course, is what do they do to him? I suspect that a good portion of the Democratic establishment, we know this because they say it, want to bankrupt him and put him in jail, including some DAs across the country, especially in New York. So that's another variable.
Yeah, that's one of the number of kind of grimly fascinating questions about the tides of public sentiment and how Trump's going to ride them, because they need him. The left needs him. The ruling classes need him, as has been clear and as many have said to now. They need this sort of figure onto which to project all their own insecurities and to use as a cudgel, as a sort of consequence, right? Where he is the thing of which we must all be afraid, and therefore you must give us your power. That's how they've been using him, and they need to continue using him, and as we've said, his supporters as well. And at least the fantasies about how that might play out, which have been aired publicly by people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and indeed the Lincoln Project, right? The kinds of fantasies that people are airing, really get grim. They really get ugly. And they're reminiscent of all sorts of terrible precedents from history. Sulla and the prescriptions comes immediately to mind. The way that people take vengeance on their political enemies when they oust them, especially enemies whom they have convinced the public are unpunishable. I'm not so sure that kind of ruin would be most to their advantage. I sort of feel like the two of both the ruling class and Trump will go off to feed off of each other, and they're kind of the theater of this great kind of battle between them, this Gotterdammerung or whatever that's going on. And if I were he, which is almost impossible for me to sort of imagine what that would be like, but if I were he, I would want no more to do with the presidency. I would feel completely hard done by, by people that were supposed to support me. Not just, his base is one thing, but they've been incredibly loyal, of course. But the Republican establishment, which have basically joined in the project to hamstring him and tie his hands, those folks have just shown themselves to be, as bad obstructors as the left. And I would feel like, well, if you don't want my talents, I'll take them elsewhere. And so I kind of, I think that his greatest use to the conservative movement going forward is as a media tycoon. And I think it would shake up some of the business dynamics that have evolved on the right in media circles. But that's okay. He would be much like Elon Musk. He has the potential to set conservatives free from a lot of the constraints that hold them back at present. But he may also, he might smart at the loss and try to make it back up. I wouldn't be out of character for him either. I guess I'm rooting for the media, for the media organization, but I'm not sure what will happen in reality.
Yeah, I think, you see a lot of jockeying about this question in the internal response to impeachment and the tone of certain legislators, et cetera. I think the savvier ones realize that they can't just wash their hands of Trump and his constituents completely. And I suspect that GOP leaders like Liz Cheney are not going to have much of a future given their conduct recently, but I could be wrong. I just think there's really, as we've discussed many times on this podcast, there's no going back to the pre-Trump GOP-E, that is GOP establishment, for those of you who aren't online much. And that doesn't, it doesn't mean you have to be a Trumpist necessarily, but it certainly means you can't be a status quo Liz Cheney, it seems. Well, unless anyone has anything pressing, we are out of time. Thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to support our work, visit claremont.org/donate. I like to emphasize we're a nonprofit. We don't really sell much besides a few magazines. 98% of our revenue comes from support from individuals, and we thank you for that, and foundations. So if you want to support us, claremont.org/donate. If you want to learn more, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, and claremontreviewbooks.com. Don't forget to rate, review, share, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks to the production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon and Annalisa Lee. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you next week.